What happens when absolute power meets unstoppable force? When someone who has never been told no suddenly faces the one group of people who don't care about titles, wealth, or royal bloodlines. This is the story of Marcus Whitfield, a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. His uniform made him invisible to consequences, and his royal connections made him invincible. For 38 years, he had never been wrong about those assumptions, until one rain-soaked Tuesday morning in downtown London, when his world of privilege collided headfirst with reality, and the universe decided it was time to collect on decades of unpaid debts. Some people call it karma, others call it justice. But for Marcus, it was simply the day he learned that no one is above the law, no matter how shiny their uniform or how royal their employer. This is the story of how one man's arrogance led to the most spectacular public takedown in recent memory, captured on dozens of phones and broadcast to millions of people who have been waiting their entire lives to see someone like Marcus get exactly what he deserved. The fall from grace wasn't just swift, it was devastating, complete, and absolutely irreversible. And it all started with a simple traffic stop that Marcus thought would end like every other interaction in his privileged life, with everyone else bowing down to his authority. Marcus Whitfield had always believed he was special. Not just special in the way that every mother tells her child they're unique and wonderful, but genuinely, fundamentally different from the ordinary people who filled the streets of London every day. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with perfectly pressed uniforms and polished boots that reflected the morning sun, Marcus carried himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from 38 years of never hearing the word no directed at him with any real authority behind it. His position as a royal guard wasn't just a job. It was his identity, his purpose, and, most importantly, his shield against the consequences that seemed to plague everyone else around him. The red tunic with its golden buttons, the tall black hat that added another foot to his already imposing height, and the ceremonial sword that hung at his side weren't just uniform pieces. They were symbols of power that opened doors, silenced complaints, and turned potential confrontations into apologetic retreats. Marcus had discovered this power early in his career. During his first month on duty, he had accidentally bumped into a woman carrying groceries outside Buckingham Palace. Instead of the angry confrontation he expected, the woman had immediately apologized to him, gathering her scattered items while repeatedly saying sorry for being in his way. That moment had been a revelation. People didn't just respect the uniform. They feared disappointing it. They feared the authority it represented and the connections it implied. Over the years, this realization had shaped how Marcus moved through the world. Traffic violations disappeared with a flash of his badge. Restaurant reservations materialized out of thin air when he mentioned his position. Parking tickets vanished from his windshield before the ink dried. Store managers overlooked minor incidents. Police officers looked the other way during routine stops, and even government officials treated him with a deference that bordered on worship. The Tuesday morning that would change everything started like every other day in Marcus's carefully ordered world. His alarm sounded at precisely 5:30, followed by a routine that had been perfected over decades. Shower, shave, breakfast consisting of exactly 2 pieces of toast with marmalade, black coffee, and a quick scan of the morning news. The weather report predicted rain, but Marcus had learned long ago that weather was something that happened to other people. His official duties rarely required him to stand outside for extended periods, and when they did, someone always ensured he had proper cover. By 7:15, Marcus was behind the wheel of his personal vehicle, a sleek black sedan that he had purchased specifically because it looked official enough to command respect while remaining understated enough to avoid unwanted attention when he preferred to blend in. The car was his sanctuary, equipped with everything he needed to maintain his image of authority: official documentation, emergency contacts that connected him directly to palace security, and a collection of credentials that had never failed to impress. The drive to his assignment that morning took him through the heart of London's financial district, where early commuters were already beginning their daily migration toward office buildings and business centers. Marcus observed them through his tinted windows with a mixture of pity and superiority. These people lived lives of routine desperation, checking their watches, worrying about train delays, calculating whether they had time for coffee before their first meetings. Their concerns seemed so small, so manageable compared to the weighty responsibilities of protecting the royal family. As he navigated the familiar streets, Marcus allowed his mind to wander to the evening ahead. He had plans to meet with several colleagues at an upscale restaurant where the manager knew him by name and always ensured he received the best table available. These dinners weren't just social occasions. They were opportunities to reinforce the network of relationships that made his privileged lifestyle possible. Over wine and expensive meals, Marcus and his fellow guards would share stories of the respect they commanded, the special treatment they received, and the general superiority of their position in society. The traffic light ahead turned red, and Marcus slowed to a stop, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as he waited. Through his rearview mirror, he noticed a small commotion developing behind him. A delivery truck had apparently cut off another vehicle, leading to an exchange of gestures and shouted words that Marcus couldn't quite hear through his closed windows. He shook his head in disgust at the childish behavior. This was exactly the kind of petty nonsense that consumed the lives of ordinary people who had never learned proper respect for authority and order. When the light changed to green, Marcus accelerated smoothly through the intersection, but his attention was immediately drawn to the flashing lights that appeared in his rearview mirror. A police car was approaching quickly, obviously responding to some emergency that Marcus was fortunate enough to avoid. He pulled slightly to the right to allow the vehicle to pass, already imagining the chaos and disorder that awaited the officers at their destination. In his experience, most police work involved cleaning up messes created by people who had never learned proper respect for rules and authority. But instead of passing him, the police car moved directly behind his vehicle, its lights continuing to flash in a pattern that Marcus suddenly recognized with a sinking feeling in his stomach. They weren't responding to an emergency somewhere else. They were conducting a traffic stop, and he was the target. Marcus felt a momentary flash of confusion, followed quickly by indignation. There had to be some mistake. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any red lights, hadn't committed any traffic violations that would warrant this kind of attention. His vehicle registration was current, his insurance was valid, and his driving record was spotless. More importantly, he was Marcus Whitfield, Royal Guard, a man whose very presence should command respect rather than suspicion. He pulled over to the side of the road, confident that this situation would be resolved quickly once the officers realized who they were dealing with. In his experience, police officers were generally reasonable people who understood the importance of showing proper deference to those in positions of authority. A quick explanation of his position, perhaps accompanied by a glimpse of his official credentials, would undoubtedly transform this minor inconvenience into an apologetic retreat. As he waited for the officers to approach his vehicle, Marcus straightened his posture and arranged his features into an expression of calm authority. He had handled similar situations before, always with complete success. The key was to project confidence without appearing arrogant, to demonstrate authority without seeming threatening, and to remind these civil servants of the respect his position commanded while allowing them to save face in the process. The officer who approached his driver's side window was young, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of serious expression that Marcus associated with people who took their minor authority far too seriously. Behind him, a second officer had positioned himself near the passenger side of the vehicle, following standard protocol for traffic stops. Marcus rolled down his window and prepared to deliver the explanation that would bring this embarrassing mistake to a swift conclusion. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of polite cooperation mixed with subtle authority that had served him well in countless similar situations. "I'm Marcus Whitfield, Royal Guard. I believe there may be some confusion here, as I haven't committed any traffic violations this morning." The young officer looked down at him with an expression that Marcus couldn't immediately read. It wasn't the immediate recognition and respect he had expected, nor was it the apologetic embarrassment that usually followed his identification. Instead, it was something that Marcus had rarely encountered in his adult life: complete indifference to his claimed authority. "License and registration, please," the officer said, as if Marcus hadn't spoken at all. Marcus felt a flicker of irritation. Clearly, this young man hadn't understood the significance of what he had just heard. "Officer, I think you misunderstood. I'm a Royal Guard. I'm currently on my way to an official assignment, and I haven't violated any traffic laws. Perhaps we could resolve this quickly so I can continue with my duties." The officer's expression didn't change. "License and registration, please," he repeated, his tone suggesting that he had no interest in Marcus's explanations or credentials. For the first time in recent memory, Marcus felt genuinely confused. In his experience, the mention of his position was supposed to end these interactions immediately. Police officers, like most civil servants, understood the hierarchy of authority and the importance of showing proper respect to those who serve the royal family. This officer's continued insistence on following standard procedures suggested either a serious misunderstanding or a level of ignorance that Marcus found difficult to believe. "Listen, young man," Marcus said, allowing a slight edge to creep into his voice, "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. I have direct access to palace security, and my duties are far more important than whatever minor traffic issue you think you've observed. I suggest you verify my credentials and then allow me to continue on my way." The officer straightened up and looked down at Marcus with what could only be described as barely controlled patience. "Sir, this is the third time I'm asking for your license and registration. If you refuse to comply, this traffic stop will become significantly more complicated for both of us." Marcus stared up at the young officer in genuine shock. In 38 years of using his position to navigate challenging situations, he had never encountered someone who remained completely unmoved by his authority. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a fundamental rejection of a natural order that had governed Marcus's entire adult life. "Are you seriously threatening a royal guard?" Marcus asked, his voice rising with indignation. "Do you have any idea what kind of consequences this could have for your career? I have connections that go directly to the top of your chain of command." The officer's partner had moved closer to the driver's side window, and Marcus could see that both men were growing tired of the conversation. "Sir," the first officer said, his tone becoming noticeably more formal, "you need to provide your license and registration immediately, or we will be forced to remove you from the vehicle." Remove him from the vehicle? Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. These civil servants were actually threatening to physically remove a royal guard from his own car during what should have been a routine traffic stop. The very suggestion was so absurd, so fundamentally wrong, that Marcus felt his anger beginning to overwhelm his shock. "You don't remove royal guards from vehicles," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard by passing pedestrians who had begun to slow down and watch the unfolding scene. "You apologize to royal guards, and then you let them continue with their important duties. I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately." The first officer looked at his partner and nodded slightly. It was a small gesture, but Marcus recognized it as some kind of signal between the two men. His confusion was beginning to transform into genuine alarm as he realized that this situation was spiraling beyond his control in ways he had never experienced before. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the first officer said, his hand moving toward his radio. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter and stared up at the officer with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I will not step out of my vehicle. I'm a royal guard, and I demand the respect that position commands. I want your names, your badge numbers, and your supervisor on the scene immediately." What Marcus didn't know was that his raised voice and increasingly aggressive posture were being interpreted by the officers as signs of potential escalation. What he also didn't know was that earlier that morning, there had been reports of a man in official-looking clothing attempting to gain unauthorized access to government buildings using false credentials. The description had been vague, but it had included details that matched Marcus's appearance and behavior closely enough to put police throughout the city on alert. The officer reached for his radio and spoke quietly into the device. Marcus couldn't hear the exact words, but he caught fragments that made his blood run cold. Possible impersonator, refusing to comply, and, most ominously, request immediate backup. Backup? They were calling for backup to deal with a royal guard who was trying to explain his position and get to work. Marcus felt the world around him beginning to shift in ways that his privileged experience had never prepared him to handle. For the first time in his adult life, his authority meant nothing, his position carried no weight, and the natural order of respect and deference that had shaped his entire worldview was crumbling around him. As he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel and staring up at two police officers who seemed completely unmoved by his authority, Marcus Whitfield had no way of knowing that his 38 years of privilege and power were about to come to a spectacular end. The universe had finally decided that it was time for Marcus to learn what life was like for everyone else, and the lesson was going to be delivered with a force that would leave him forever changed. The sound of additional sirens in the distance suggested that backup was already on the way, and Marcus was about to discover just how different the world looked when you were on the wrong side of absolute authority. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder with each passing second, and Marcus felt his confidence beginning to crack under the weight of a situation that refused to follow the script he had used successfully for decades. Through his side mirror, he could see more police vehicles approaching, their emergency lights painting the morning street in alternating patterns of red and blue that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his accelerating heartbeat. "This is insane," Marcus muttered to himself, still gripping the steering wheel as if it were an anchor that might somehow pull him back into the familiar world where his authority mattered and his position commanded respect. They can't treat a royal guard like this. There are protocols. There are procedures. There are people I can call. The first officer had stepped back from his window and was speaking into his radio again, his voice low but urgent. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation that sent chills down his spine. Subject refusing compliance, possible impersonation, and escalating situation. Each phrase felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of his carefully constructed life. A second police car had pulled up behind the first, followed quickly by a third. Marcus counted at least 6 officers now surrounding his vehicle, their postures alert and professional in a way that suggested they were treating this as something far more serious than a routine traffic stop. The crowd of pedestrians that had initially slowed to watch the unfolding drama had grown larger, with people pulling out their phones and pointing them in his direction. "Sir," the first officer called out, his tone now carrying the kind of authority that Marcus had always believed belonged to him. "This is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily. Step out of the vehicle with your hands visible, or we will be forced to extract you." Extract him? The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of wielding authority, he had never been on the receiving end of language like this. The officers weren't asking him to step out, they were ordering him. They weren't treating him as a fellow authority figure who deserved respect. They were treating him like a suspect who posed a potential threat. "I'm a royal guard," Marcus shouted through his open window, his voice carrying across the street and drawing even more attention for passers-by. "I protect the royal family. I have been personally commended by members of the royal household. You cannot treat me like some common criminal." But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus could see that they were having no effect on the officers surrounding his vehicle. If anything, his protests seemed to be confirming their suspicions rather than alleviating them. The way they looked at him had shifted from professional caution to genuine concern, as if his claims of royal connections were further evidence that he was mentally unstable or deliberately deceptive. A new voice cut through the tension, belonging to an older officer who had emerged from one of the recently arrived vehicles. "I'm Sergeant Williams," the man announced, approaching Marcus's window with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of experience handling difficult situations. "I understand there's been some confusion here this morning." Finally, Marcus thought someone with enough experience and wisdom to recognize the mistake that was being made. Sergeant Williams looked like the kind of career police officer who would understand the importance of showing proper respect to those who serve the crown. His gray hair and weathered face suggested he had seen enough in his career to know when to exercise discretion and when to follow protocol. "Sergeant, thank God," Marcus said, relief flooding his voice as he prepared to explain the situation to someone who would surely understand. "I'm Marcus Whitfield, Royal Guard. I've been trying to explain to your officers that there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't violated any traffic laws, and I need to get to my assignment. Perhaps you could help clear this up?" Sergeant Williams studied Marcus carefully, his experienced eyes taking in details that the younger officers might have missed. He noted the quality of Marcus's clothing, the expensive watch on his wrist, the confident way he held himself despite the circumstances. But he also noted things that Marcus didn't realize were visible. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted between the officers, the increasing desperation in his voice. "Mr. Whitfield," Sergeant Williams said slowly, "I'm going to need to see some identification. Official identification that confirms your position as a Royal Guard." Marcus felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone was asking for his credentials instead of dismissing his claims outright. He reached for his wallet, confident that once these officers saw his official documentation, this nightmare would come to an end. But as his fingers closed around the leather billfold, a horrifying realization struck him like a lightning bolt. His official Royal Guard identification was in his other wallet, the wallet he had left sitting on his dresser at home after switching jackets the night before. The wallet that contained not just his Royal Guard credentials, but also his special access cards, his emergency contact information, and all the documentation that proved he was who he claimed to be. Marcus stared down at the wallet in his hands, feeling the color drain from his face as he realized the magnitude of his situation. The wallet he had with him contained his regular driver's license, his credit cards, and various membership cards, but nothing that identified him as a Royal Guard. Nothing that would convince these officers he was anything more than an ordinary citizen making extraordinary claims. "There's been a complication," Marcus said slowly, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to explain this development without sounding even more suspicious. "I have my regular identification with me, but my official Royal Guard credentials are at home. I switched jackets last night and forgot to transfer my work identification." The silence that followed his explanation was deafening. Marcus could see the officers exchanging glances that clearly communicated their growing conviction that they were dealing with either a delusional individual or an elaborate impersonator. His story, which was perfectly true, sounded exactly like the kind of excuse that someone making false claims would invent when pressed for proof. "So you're claiming to be a Royal Guard, but you don't have any identification to support that claim?" Sergeant Williams asked, his tone remaining professional but clearly skeptical. "It's at home," Marcus insisted, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice. "I can give you the number for palace security. I can provide references. I've been a Royal Guard for 15 years. This is just a simple misunderstanding that can be cleared up with a phone call." But even as he spoke, Marcus realized how weak his position had become. He was asking police officers to believe that he was a highly placed government employee who had somehow forgotten all of his identification, who couldn't prove his identity, and who was becoming increasingly agitated when questioned about his claims. From a perspective, he probably looked exactly like the kind of person who would impersonate a Royal Guard for personal gain or attention. "Mr. Whitfield," Sergeant Williams said, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle so we can sort this out properly. If you really are who you claim to be, we'll get it straightened out. But right now, I need your cooperation." Marcus looked around at the circle of officers surrounding his car and realized that he had reached a point where compliance was no longer optional. The respectful requests had ended, and what remained was a direct order from law enforcement officers who clearly viewed him as a potential threat. His 38 years of experience wielding authority had not prepared him for being on the receiving end of that same kind of absolute power. "This is wrong," Marcus said as he slowly opened his car door. "This is completely wrong. I'm a Royal Guard. I serve the Crown. I have rights. I have protections. You cannot treat me like this." But Even as he protested, Marcus was stepping out of his vehicle with his hands raised, following the instructions being given to him by officers who showed no sign of being impressed by his claims or intimidated by his protests. The moment his feet touched the pavement, he felt a fundamental shift in his relationship with the world around him. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely subject to someone else's authority with no recourse, no special treatment, and no escape route. "Hands on the vehicle, please," one of the officers instructed, guiding Marcus toward the hood of his car. "We need to conduct a search to ensure everyone's safety." A search? They were going to search him like a common criminal? Marcus felt his indignation flare again, but it was now mixed with a growing sense of panic as he realized just how far this situation had spiraled beyond his control. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, and he could see people recording the scene with their phones, capturing his humiliation for potential broadcast to the entire world. "I do not consent to a search," Marcus declared, trying to summon some remnant of his former authority. "I'm a royal guard, and I have rights that protect me from this kind of treatment." "Sir, at this point, we're conducting a search for officer safety," Sergeant Williams explained, his tone remaining professional despite Marcus's protests. "If you truly are a royal guard, then you understand the importance of following proper procedures in potentially dangerous situations." The irony of having police procedure explained to him by the very people he had always considered to be lower in the hierarchy of authority was not lost on Marcus. Throughout his career, he had been the one explaining protocol to others, the one demanding compliance from people who had no choice but to submit to his requirements. Now he was discovering what it felt like to be on the other side of that relationship. As the officers began their search, Marcus felt hands patting down his clothing, checking his pockets, examining his belongings with the kind of thorough professionalism that left no doubt about their training and experience. It was efficient, impersonal, and completely degrading in ways that Marcus had never imagined possible. Every pat, every check, every moment of the search reinforced his new reality. He was no longer the person with authority in this interaction. "What's this?" one of the officers asked, pulling a small device from Marcus's jacket pocket. Marcus looked over to see the officer holding his personal radio, a device he used to stay in communication with other security personnel during his duties. To Marcus, it was simply a tool of his trade, as normal and unremarkable as a carpenter's hammer or a doctor's stethoscope. But he could see immediately that to these officers, it looked like something far more suspicious. "It's my work radio," Marcus explained, but he could hear how the words sounded to ears that were already convinced he was lying. "All royal guards carry communication devices. It's standard equipment." The officers examined the radio carefully, noting its professional quality and official appearance. But instead of serving as evidence that Marcus was telling the truth, the device seemed to reinforce their suspicions. In their experience, elaborate props were often used by people attempting sophisticated impersonations of authority figures. "This is a pretty expensive piece of equipment for someone who claims to be a royal guard but doesn't have any identification," one of the younger officers observed. Marcus stared at the man in disbelief. "It's expensive because it's real. It's official equipment issued to actual royal guards. The fact that it's high quality should prove that I'm telling the truth, not make you more suspicious." But even as he spoke, Marcus could see that his logic was having the opposite effect of what he intended. The more evidence he presented, the more convinced the officers became that they were dealing with someone who had gone to great lengths to create a convincing but false identity. His expensive equipment, his detailed knowledge of royal guard procedures, even his passionate insistence on his identity, all seemed to support the theory that he was an elaborate fraud rather than the genuine article. The search continued, revealing more items that Marcus considered routine tools of his profession, but that the officers viewed as potential evidence of impersonation. His collection of official-looking cards, his detailed knowledge of palace security procedures, even his perfectly pressed clothing all seemed to fit the profile of someone who had studied royal guards closely enough to create a convincing disguise. "Sergeant," one of the officers called out, "we're going to need the van." "The van?" Marcus felt his confusion spike to new levels. What do they need a van for? But as he looked around at the scene that had developed around him, he began to understand the magnitude of the situation he found himself in. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It wasn't even just a case of mistaken identity. These officers believed they had uncovered something significant, and they were preparing to treat him accordingly. "What van?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "The prisoner transport van," Sergeant Williams explained matter-of-factly. "We're going to need to take you in for questioning until we can verify your identity and determine whether any crimes have been committed." Prisoner transport van. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one driving home the reality of his new situation. They weren't just detaining him, they were arresting him. They weren't treating him as a confused citizen who needed assistance. They were treating him as a suspected criminal who required secure transportation. "You cannot arrest a royal guard," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying across the street and drawing even more attention from the growing crowd of spectators. "This is illegal. This is impossible. I demand to speak to my supervisor immediately." But even as he protested, Marcus could hear the sound of another vehicle approaching, and he turned to see a large black van pulling up to the scene. The sight of it made his knees weak as he realized that this nightmare was about to take another turn for the worse. His privileged life, his unquestioned authority, his 38 years of special treatment were all about to disappear behind the locked doors of a police transport vehicle. As the van came to a stop and officers began preparing for his transport, Marcus Whitfield experienced a moment of clarity that cut through his panic and confusion. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly powerless. For the first time in decades, no one cared about his claims of authority. And for the first time ever, he was about to discover what the world looked like from the perspective of everyone he had ever looked down upon. The universe wasn't finished with Marcus Whitfield yet. In fact, it was just getting started. The back of the police transport van was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced in his privileged life. The metal bench was cold and uncomfortable against his back. The small windows were reinforced with wire mesh that divided the outside world into tiny squares, and the entire space smelled of disinfectant mixed with the lingering odors of previous occupants who had made this same humiliating journey. As the van pulled away from the scene of his arrest, Marcus pressed his face against the small window and watched the crowd of spectators who had gathered to witness his downfall. Many of them were still holding up their phones, recording his transportation like he was some kind of celebrity scandal. In a way, he supposed he was. How often did people get to see a man who claimed to be a royal guard being loaded into a police van like a common criminal? The irony was devastating. For 15 years, Marcus had been part of the system that maintained order and authority in society. He had stood guard over the most important people in the country, had been trusted with secrets that could affect national security, had worn uniforms that commanded instant respect from everyone he encountered. Now he was sitting in the back of a police van, his hands secured behind his back with plastic zip ties, being transported to a detention facility like any other suspected criminal. The journey to the police station took 23 minutes, though it felt like hours to Marcus as he struggled to process the complete reversal of his circumstances. Every bump in the road, every turn of the wheels, every minute that passed carried him further away from the world where his authority mattered and deeper into a system where he was just another suspect requiring processing. When the van finally stopped and the doors opened, Marcus found himself looking up at the back entrance of a police station that he had driven past hundreds of times during his career. He had always viewed these buildings as necessary institutions staffed by people who shared his commitment to maintaining order and respecting authority. He had never imagined that he would see one from the inside as anything other than a visiting dignitary or respected colleague. "Step out, please, sir," the transport officer instructed, his tone polite, but firm in the way that suggested cooperation was expected rather than requested. Marcus climbed out of the van on unsteady legs, his body cramped from the uncomfortable seating and his mind still reeling from the surreal nature of his situation. The loading dock area behind the police station was utilitarian and sterile, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. It was the kind of place where the ugly business of law enforcement happened away from public view, where the pretense of civility gave way to the harsh realities of detention and interrogation. As he was led through a series of security doors, Marcus noticed the way the officers around him moved with practiced efficiency. They had obviously done this hundreds of times before, guiding suspects through the same process, following the same procedures, maintaining the same professional detachment that Marcus himself had once employed when dealing with people he considered beneath his station. Processing area, one of the officers announced, directing Marcus into a room filled with desks, computers, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and defeated. "Take a seat at desk 3. Marcus sat down in the plastic chair and looked around at his surroundings with a mixture of fascination and horror. This was where criminals were brought when they were arrested. This was where their personal information was recorded, their photographs were taken, their fingerprints were collected. The idea that he was about to go through the same process was so absurd that part of his mind kept insisting it had to be some kind of elaborate mistake that would be corrected at any moment. "Name?" the processing officer asked, settling behind the desk with a form that looked like it had been designed by someone who valued efficiency over human dignity. "Marcus Whitfield," he answered, then immediately added, "Royal Guard, currently employed by His Majesty's household, with security clearance level 7 and direct access to palace communications." The officer looked up at him with an expression that Marcus had seen directed at him many times during his career, though never from this side of the interaction. It was the look that people gave to individuals who were clearly delusional or lying, the look that suggested patience was running thin and cooperation was becoming mandatory rather than voluntary. "Mr. Whitfield," the officer said slowly, "you can drop the Royal Guard routine. We've already checked with Palace Security, and they have no record of anyone by your name in their employment records." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. No record? That was impossible. He had been employed as a Royal Guard for 15 years. He had a personnel file, employment records, security clearances, performance evaluations. He had supervised junior guards, had been commended by senior officials, had been personally thanked by members of the royal family for his dedicated service. "There must be some mistake in your inquiry," Marcus said, his voice rising with renewed panic. "I've been a Royal Guard since 2009. My employee number is RG 7749. I report directly to Captain Harrison in the Security Division. My security clearance was last updated 6 months ago." The processing officer made a note on his form, but his expression remained skeptical. "Sir, we conducted a thorough check of all royal household employment records. There is no Marcus Whitfield listed as either current or former Royal Guard. There is no employee number RG 7749 in their system, and there is no Captain Harrison in their security division." Marcus stared at the officer in complete bewilderment. What the man was saying was impossible. Not just unlikely or confusing, but literally impossible. Marcus had physical evidence of his employment. Uniforms hanging in his closet, identification cards in his home, official documentation of his service. He had pay stubs, tax records, colleagues who knew him by name. His entire life for the past 15 years had been built around his position as a Royal Guard. "Call Captain Harrison," Marcus insisted, his voice becoming more desperate. "Call the duty office. Call anyone in Royal Security. They know me. I've been working there for 15 years. "Mr. Whitfield," the officer said with the kind of patience that suggested he had dealt with similar delusions before, "we've spoken with multiple people in Royal Security. Not only do they not know who you are, they've assured us that their hiring practices and security procedures would make it impossible for someone to be employed in that capacity without their knowledge." The room seemed to spin around Marcus as he tried to process what he was being told. According to these officers, his entire career was a fiction. His job, his colleagues, his supervisor, even his employee number were all figments of his imagination or elaborate lies. But that couldn't be true. He had memories of 15 years of service. He had photographs of himself in uniform. He had detailed knowledge of royal security procedures and protocols. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, pressing his hands against his temples as he tried to make sense of what was happening to him. I know Captain Harrison. I had coffee with him last week. We discussed the new security protocols for the summer events. I was there. I was part of those conversations. But even as he spoke, Marcus began to notice something disturbing about his own memories. When he tried to focus on specific details of his conversations with Captain Harrison, they seemed strangely vague and generic. When he attempted to recall specific dates or events from his career, they blurred together in ways that didn't seem quite right. It was as if his 15 years of service were filled with impressions and general recollections rather than the sharp, specific memories that should accompany such a long and distinguished career. Let's try a different approach, the processing officer said, pulling out a different form. What's your current address? Marcus provided his address, confident that at least this information would check out properly. He had been living in the same apartment for 8 years, had paid rent regularly, had neighbors who knew him by name. Surely his housing situation would provide some stability in a world that seemed to be crumbling around him. The officer made a phone call that lasted several minutes, during which Marcus could only hear one side of a conversation that seemed to become increasingly puzzling. When the call ended, the officer looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed confusion with growing concern. Mr. Whitfield, I just spoke with your landlord. According to his records, you moved out of that apartment 3 months ago. The unit is currently occupied by a family with 2 children who have been living there since September. 3 months ago? That was impossible. Marcus had been in his apartment that very morning. He had showered there, had breakfast there, had collected his keys and wallet from the dresser in his bedroom. He could describe every detail of the space. The kitchen with its outdated appliances, the living room with its worn carpet, the bedroom with its view of the courtyard. How could he be living in an apartment that he had supposedly moved out of months ago? There's been a mistake, Marcus said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. I live there now. I was there this morning. I can describe the interior layout, the location of the furniture, even what I had for breakfast. The processing officer made another note and continued with his questions, but Marcus could see that each answer he provided was making his situation worse rather than better. His employment history was fictional, his housing situation was impossible, and his identification documents raised more questions than they answered. From the perspective of law enforcement, he was looking more like someone who had constructed an elaborate false identity for reasons that remained unclear. Mr. Whitfield, a new voice interrupted, belonging to a detective who had entered the processing area while Marcus was struggling with his housing situation. I am Detective Sarah Chen. I'd like to speak with you about your activities over the past few months. Detective Chun was a small woman in her 40s with the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that Marcus associated with people who were very good at their jobs. She carried herself with an authority that Marcus recognized and respected, though he found it deeply unsettling to be on the receiving end of that same focused attention that he had once directed at others. Detective, thank God, Marcus said, feeling a surge of hope that someone with more experience and authority might be able to sort out the confusion that seemed to be engulfing his life. I'm Marcus Whitfield, Royal Guard. There's been some kind of massive misunderstanding. These officers think I'm impersonating a Royal Guard, but I've been employed in that position for 15 years. Detective Chun studied Marcus carefully, taking in his appearance, his demeanor, and the obvious sincerity of his confusion. She had seen enough suspects over the years to recognize when someone was lying, when they were delusional, and when they were genuinely confused about their own circumstances. Marcus didn't fit neatly into any of those categories, which made him particularly interesting from an investigative perspective. Mr. Whitfield, she said, settling into a chair across from him. I've been reviewing the reports from this morning's incident, and I have to admit that your case is rather unusual. Most people who impersonate authority figures have clear motives. They're trying to avoid tickets, gain access to restricted areas, or impress people. But you seem genuinely convinced that you are who you claim to be. Because I am who I claim to be, Marcus insisted. I understand that your officers couldn't verify my employment immediately, but there has to be some kind of administrative error or computer glitch. If you'll just give me access to a phone, I can contact people who know me, people who can vouch for my identity and my position." Detective Chin nodded thoughtfully. "Actually, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to let you make some phone calls, and we're going to verify your story as thoroughly as possible. But I want you to understand that if your claims prove to be false, if you've been deliberately impersonating a royal guard, the charges you'll face are quite serious." Marcus felt a flood of relief wash over him. Finally, someone was willing to conduct a proper investigation rather than simply dismissing his claims. Once he was able to contact his colleagues, his supervisor, even his neighbors, this nightmare would come to an end. People would vouch for him, records would be located, and he would be released with apologies for the inconvenience. "Thank you, Detective," Marcus said. "I appreciate your willingness to investigate properly. Once you verify my identity, I hope we could discuss the serious lapses in procedure that led to this situation." Detective Chun smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that suggested she shared Marcus's confidence about the outcome of their investigation. "Mr. Whitfield, I've been doing this job for 18 years, and I've learned that the truth has a way of revealing itself when you dig deep enough. We're going to dig very deep into your story." As Marcus was led to a small room with a phone and a table, he felt more confident than he had since this ordeal began. Soon, he would be speaking with people who knew him, people who could confirm his identity and his position. The confusion would be cleared up, the misunderstanding would be resolved, and he would return to his normal life with a story to tell about the day the system temporarily failed him. What Marcus didn't know was that Detective Chun had already begun her investigation, and the preliminary results were far more disturbing than anything that had happened to him so far. The apartment he claimed to live in had indeed been vacated 3 months ago, but not by him. The previous tenant had been a man named Marcus Whitfield, but that man had died in a car accident the day after moving out. The Royal Guard uniform hanging in what Marcus believed to be his closet was actually part of a costume collection owned by someone who did historical reenactments. The identification cards he was so confident would prove his identity had never been issued by any government agency. And, most disturbing of all, the people Marcus was about to call, the colleagues he was certain would vouch for him, didn't exist. Detective Chun had seen cases of mistaken identity before, and she had dealt with elaborate imposters who created false personas for criminal purposes. But she had never encountered someone who seemed to have constructed an entirely fictional life so completely that they genuinely believed it was real. Marcus Whitfield was either the most sophisticated con artist she had ever met, or he was suffering from a psychological condition that had created false memories so detailed and convincing that they had become his reality. Either way, she was about to watch a man's entire sense of self collapse when he discovered that the life he remembered living had never actually existed. And she wasn't sure which possibility worried her more: that Marcus was a criminal who had fooled even himself, or that he was a victim of something far more disturbing than anyone had yet realized. The phone room at the police station was small and sterile, with gray walls, a metal table, and a single chair that had been designed for function rather than comfort. Marcus sat down with a mixture of relief and anticipation, confident that the next few phone calls would resolve the nightmare that had consumed his morning and restore him to his rightful place in the world. Detective Chun had provided him with a notepad and pen, encouraging him to write down the names and numbers of people who could verify his identity. Marcus had filled an entire page with contacts: his supervisor, Captain Harrison, his colleagues in the Royal Guard, his neighbors, even his local bank manager who had known him for years. Each name on the list represented a person who could confirm his story and put an end to this elaborate misunderstanding. "Take your time, Mr. Whitfield," Detective Chin said, settling into a chair on the opposite side of the table. "We want to be thorough." Marcus picked up the phone and dialed the number for Palace Security, the direct line that he had called hundreds of times during his career. As the phone rang, he felt his confidence returning. In just a few moments, he would be speaking with people who knew him well, people who would be shocked to learn that he had been arrested and treated like a criminal. "Palace Security, this is Thompson," A voice answered after 3 rings. Thompson. Thank God, Marcus said, recognizing the voice of someone he had worked with for years. This is Marcus Whitfield. I'm calling from a police station. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, and I need you to verify my employment with the Royal Guard Division. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sound that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. It might have been confusion or concern or something else entirely. I'm sorry, Thompson said slowly, but I don't know anyone named Marcus Whitfield. You said you work in the Royal Guard Division. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Thompson knew him well. They had shared shifts, had eaten lunch together, had discussed security protocols on countless occasions. How could Thompson claim not to know him? Thompson, it's Marcus, he said, forcing his voice to remain calm. We've worked together for years. You trained me on the radio protocols when I first started. We had lunch together last Tuesday in the staff cafeteria. Sir, I think there's been some confusion, Thompson replied, his voice carrying the kind of professional patience that suggested he was dealing with someone who might be mentally unstable. I've been with Royal Security for 12 years, and I can assure you that I don't know anyone named Marcus Whitfield. Additionally, we don't have a staff cafeteria. Our personnel eat in the general government building facilities. No staff cafeteria? That couldn't be right. Marcus had eaten in the Royal Security cafeteria hundreds of times. He could describe its layout, remember conversations he had there, even recall what he had ordered for lunch just days ago. How could Thompson claim it didn't exist? Thompson, listen carefully, Marcus said, desperation creeping into his voice. I'm Royal Guard number RG 7749. I report to Captain Harrison in Security Division. I've been employed there since 2009. You have to remember me. Sir, I'm going to transfer you to my supervisor, Thompson said, his tone suggesting that he was following protocol for dealing with potentially disturbed callers. Please hold the line. The whole music that came through the phone was cheerful and completely inappropriate for Marcus's growing panic. As he waited, he looked across the table at Detective Chun, who was watching him with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was noting every detail of his behavior and reactions. This is Supervisor Mitchell, a new voice said, interrupting the hold music. I understand you're calling about employment verification? Yes, finally, Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. I'm Marcus Whitfield, Royal Guard RG 7749. I work in your security division under Captain Harrison. I'm calling from a police station where there's been a terrible misunderstanding about my identity. Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to be very clear with you, Supervisor Mitchell said, his tone carrying the kind of authority that Marcus recognized and respected. We have no employee by your name, no employee number matching what you've provided, and no Captain Harrison in our security division. Furthermore, our security protocols would make it impossible for someone to be employed here without our knowledge. That's impossible, Marcus whispered, feeling the room begin to spin around him. I've worked there for 15 years. I know the building layout. I know the security procedures. I know the names of dozens of people in your department. Sir, if you continue to make these false claims, we'll be forced to involve law enforcement, Supervisor Mitchell warned. Impersonating a royal guard is a serious offense, and we take such matters very seriously. Marcus hung up the phone with shaking hands, staring at Detective Chun in complete bewilderment. The people he had worked with for years were claiming they had never heard of him. The job he had held for 15 years apparently didn't exist. The life he remembered living seemed to be nothing more than an elaborate fiction. Try another number, Detective Chun suggested gently, though Marcus could see the concern in her eyes. Perhaps someone outside of work? Marcus dialed his neighbor Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment next to his and who always greeted him warmly when they met in the hallway. She had borrowed items from him, had asked him to check on her cat when she went away, had even brought him homemade cookies during the holidays. Hello. Mrs. Patterson's familiar voice answered after several rings. Mrs. Patterson, this is Marcus from next door, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm calling from a police station. There's been a misunderstanding about my identity, and I need you to verify that you know me. I'm sorry, dear, but I think you have the wrong number, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the kind of confusion that suggested she genuinely didn't recognize his voice. I don't know anyone named Marcus, and there's no one living in the apartment next to me. That unit has been empty for months. Empty for months? Marcus had seen Mrs. Patterson just 2 days ago. They had discussed her cat's health problems and her concerns about the building's new management company. How could she claim not to know him when they had been neighbors for years? Mrs. Patterson, please, Marcus pleaded. It's Marcus Whitfield from apartment 4B. You made me cookies last Christmas. We talked about your cat Whiskers just Tuesday morning. Young man, I think you're confused, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice becoming concerned. I don't have a cat named Whiskers. I'm allergic to cats. And apartment 4B has been vacant since the previous tenant died in that terrible car accident. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone in his hand as if it had become a foreign object. Mrs. Patterson didn't remember him. The apartment he lived in was supposedly empty. Even his neighbor's cat, which he had petted and played with dozens of times, apparently didn't exist. Mr. Whitfield, Detective Chin said softly, I think we need to discuss what's really happening here. Marcus looked across the table at her, seeing his own confusion and fear reflected in her eyes. Detective, I don't understand what's going on. These people know me. I've worked with them, lived near them, interacted with them for years. How can they all claim not to know who I am? Detective Chun leaned forward, her expression showing the kind of concern that suggested she was dealing with something far more complex than a simple case of impersonation. Mr. Whitfield, I've been investigating your claims while you've been making these phone calls. What I've discovered is very troubling. She opened a folder that had been sitting on the table and spread several documents across its surface. Marcus could see official-looking papers, photographs, and what appear to be various records and reports. The apartment you claim to live in was indeed occupied by someone named Marcus Whitfield, Detective Chin continued. But that person moved out 3 months ago and died in a car accident the following day. The Royal Guard uniform you describe hanging in your closet belongs to a historical reenactment society. The identification cards you're so confident about have never been issued by any government agency. Marcus stared down at the documents, trying to process what he was being told. That's impossible. I remember living there. I remember getting dressed this morning. I remember having breakfast at my kitchen table. Mr. Whitfield, I need to ask you some very important questions, and I need you to think carefully about your answers, Detective Chin said. What's the last thing you clearly remember before this morning? Marcus tried to focus on his recent memories, but they seemed strangely vague and insubstantial. He remembered having breakfast, but he couldn't recall what he had eaten or what the kitchen had looked like. He remembered getting dressed in his Royal Guard uniform, but he couldn't bring to mind the specific details of putting it on or where it had been hanging. I remember yesterday, Marcus said slowly, but even as he spoke, he realized that his memories of yesterday were more like impressions than actual recollections. I worked a shift at the palace. I came home. I watched television. What did you watch? Detective Chun asked gently. Marcus tried to remember, but found that he couldn't recall a single specific program, advertisement, or even what channel he had been watching. It was as if his memory contained the general concept of watching television without any of the specific details that should accompany such an activity. Can you tell me what you ate for breakfast this morning? Detective Chun continued. Again, Marcus found that while he was certain he had eaten breakfast, he couldn't remember what he had consumed, where he had sat, or even what dishes he had used. The memory was there, but it lacked substance, like trying to grasp smoke with his bare hands. Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to share something with you that might be difficult to hear, Detective Chin said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that suggested she was about to deliver news that would fundamentally change his understanding of reality. Based on our investigation, we believe that you may be suffering from a condition that has created false memories so detailed and convincing that you genuinely believe they represent your actual life experiences. False memories? Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his mind as he tried to process what she was telling him. That's not possible. I remember 15 years of work. I remember relationships, conversations, experiences. Those can't all be false. The human brain is capable of creating incredibly detailed false memories, especially under certain conditions, Detective Chen explained. Trauma, stress, medical conditions, even exposure to certain substances can cause the mind to construct elaborate fictional histories that feel completely real to the person experiencing them. Marcus looked down at his hands, trying to find something solid and real to anchor himself to, as his entire sense of identity began to crumble around him. If his memories were false, then who was he? What was he? Where had he come from? And how had he ended up in this situation? I don't understand, he whispered. If I'm not Marcus Whitfield, the Royal Guard, then who am I? Where did I come from? How did I get here? Detective Chun reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on his arm. That's what we're going to find out. But first, I need you to understand that you're not in trouble. You're not being charged with impersonation because we don't believe you were deliberately trying to deceive anyone. We think you're a victim of something, not a perpetrator. A victim? Marcus looked up at her with eyes that reflected a confusion so deep it seemed to reach into his soul. A victim of what? We're not sure yet, Detective Chen admitted. But we're going to find out. We're going to discover who you really are, where you really came from, and what happened to create these false memories. And we're going to help you deal with whatever we discover. As Marcus sat in that small room, surrounded by evidence that his entire life was a fiction, he felt something die inside him. The confident, authoritative man who had awakened that morning believing himself to be a Royal Guard with 15 years of distinguished service was gone, replaced by someone who didn't know his own name, his own history, or even his own identity. But even as his old self crumbled away, Marcus began to sense something else emerging from the ruins of his false memories. It was small and fragile, but it was real in a way that his fictional life had never been. It was the possibility of discovering who he truly was beneath all the elaborate constructions his mind had created. The universe wasn't finished with Marcus Whitfield yet. In fact, it was just beginning to reveal the truth about who he really was and how he had ended up living a life that had never actually existed. And that truth was going to be far stranger than anything his false memories had ever contained. 3 weeks had passed since the morning that had shattered Marcus Whitfield's entire understanding of reality, and he now sat in a comfortable chair in Dr. Sarah Morrison's office, staring out the window at a world that seemed both familiar and completely foreign to him. The intensive psychological evaluation and medical testing that had followed his arrest had revealed truths that were far stranger than any fiction his damaged mind could have created. "How are you feeling today, David?" Dr. Morrison asked, using the name that had been discovered through fingerprint analysis and missing person reports. David. His real name was David Chun, and he was 35 years old, not 38 as he had believed. He had been missing for 4 months, having disappeared after leaving work one evening at the accounting firm, where he had been employed as a senior financial analyst. His family had been searching for him desperately, filing missing person reports and hiring private investigators to try to locate their son and brother who had simply vanished without a trace. "It's still strange hearing my real name," David admitted, his voice carrying a weariness that came from having his entire sense of self reconstructed from scratch. "Sometimes I still think of myself as Marcus. Those memories feel so real, even though I know they're not." The medical explanation for David's condition was as fascinating as it was terrifying. A rare combination of factors had conspired to create what Dr. Morrison called extensive false memory syndrome, triggered by a severe concussion he had suffered during a mugging that had occurred on the night he disappeared. The head injury, combined with exposure to an experimental drug that his attackers had used to incapacitate him, had caused his brain to essentially reboot itself with an entirely fictional identity. The human brain's capacity for creating false memories is remarkable, Dr. Morrison had explained during one of their early sessions. In your case, the trauma and chemical exposure cause your mind to construct not just false memories, but an entire false life complete with career, relationships, and experiences that felt absolutely real to you. But The most disturbing discovery had been where David had been living during the 4 months of his disappearance. The address he had given to police, the apartment where he believed he had lived for years, was indeed real. But it had been abandoned for months, and David had been living there illegally, somehow managing to survive in a space that had no electricity, no water, and no legal occupancy. His Royal Guard uniform had been found there, along with the radio and identification card that had seemed so authentic. They were elaborate props, apparently created by David's damaged mind during periods when he was lucid enough to function, but not coherent enough to understand that he was constructing evidence for a life that had never existed. The brain scans show that the areas responsible for memory formation and identity construction were severely affected by your injury, Dr. Morrison continued, referring to the thick file of medical reports that documented David's condition. Your mind essentially created a new identity to fill the gaps left by the trauma, and that identity became so detailed and convincing that it overwrote your actual memories. David nodded, though he still struggled to accept the medical explanation for his condition. The memories of being Marcus Whitfield remained vivid and emotionally powerful, even though he now knew they were false. He could still remember conversations with colleagues who didn't exist, meals in restaurants he had never visited, and experiences that had never actually happened to him. "My family came to see me yesterday," David said, changing the subject to something that felt more manageable than the complex medical explanations for his condition. "My sister brought photo albums, pictures of her childhood, family vacations, birthdays. It's strange looking at photographs of myself and not remembering any of the moments they captured." The reunion with his family had been both joyful and heartbreaking. David's parents and sister had been overjoyed to discover that he was alive and physically unharmed, but the man they found was not the same person who had disappeared 4 months earlier. David Chun, the accountant, was gone, replaced by someone who remembered a completely different life and struggled to connect with people who claimed to love him but felt like strangers. Memory recovery in cases like yours is possible, but it's not guaranteed, Dr. Morrison explained gently. Some patients recover their original memories completely. Others never do, but learn to build new relationships based on their current identity. And some experience a gradual blending of their false and real memories that creates a hybrid identity. David found himself hoping for the third option. While the discovery that his entire life as Marcus Whitfield had been a fiction was devastating, those false memories had also given him experiences and confidence that his real personality had apparently lacked. David Chun had been a quiet, somewhat timid man who rarely spoke up in meetings and avoided confrontation. Marcus Whitfield, despite his arrogance, had possessed a confidence and authority that David found himself wanting to retain. "There's something else we need to discuss," Dr. Morrison said, opening a different folder that David hadn't seen before. "The police investigation into your case has uncovered some information about the night you disappeared." David looked up with interest. The details of his attack and the beginning of his false memories remained a complete blank, even after weeks of therapy and medical treatment. He remembered leaving work that evening, but everything after that was darkness until he had awakened as Marcus Whitfield months later. "Your attackers have been identified," Dr. Morrison continued. "They were part of a group that had been experimenting with a combination of drugs designed to create temporary amnesia for robbery victims. The idea was to incapacitate people long enough to rob them, then ensure they couldn't remember the attackers or the details of the crime. But something went wrong with me," David said, beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened to him. "Your head injury, combined with the experimental drug, created a perfect storm that led to your extended memory loss and false identity construction," Dr. Morrison confirmed. "The drug was supposed to create temporary amnesia lasting a few hours. Instead, it interacted with your brain trauma to create months of false memories." The irony was not lost on David that his transformation from a timid accountant into a confident royal guard had been the result of a criminal experiment gone wrong. His attackers had intended to rob him and leave him with a few hours of memory loss. Instead, they had accidentally created an entirely new person who had lived a fictional life for months. The legal implications are complex, Dr. Morrison continued. The men who attacked you are facing serious charges, but your case has also raised questions about identity, criminal responsibility, and victim rights that have never been addressed in law before. David found himself less interested in the legal complications than in the fundamental questions about identity and memory that his case had raised. If his memories as Marcus Whitfield felt real to him, were they real in any meaningful sense? If his personality had been genuinely changed by his false memories, was he still the same person his family remembered? Dr. Morrison, David said, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me since I learned the truth about my condition. Of course, the man I was as Marcus Whitfield, even though those memories were false, felt more real to me than the person my family says I used to be. I was confident, authoritative, respected. I commanded attention and demanded respect. Even though I now know that life was a fiction, I felt more like myself during those months than I do now that I know my real identity. Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. That's not unusual in cases like yours. The false identity your brain created may have been based on personality traits that were always present, but suppressed in your original identity. Brain injuries can sometimes remove psychological barriers that prevented people from expressing certain aspects of their personality. So in a strange way, being Marcus Whitfield might have made me more myself than I had ever been before. It's possible, Dr. Morrison agreed. The trauma that created your false memories may have also freed you from social anxieties and self-doubt that had limited your original personality. The question now is whether you can integrate the positive aspects of your false identity with the reality of your true one. David sat quietly for several minutes, contemplating the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had begun the day 3 weeks ago as a confident royal guard who believed himself superior to everyone around him. He had ended it as a confused victim of crime and brain injury who didn't know his own name. But perhaps there was a third possibility. He could become someone new, someone who combined the best aspects of both identities. I've been thinking about my future, David said finally. My job at the accounting firm is still available. My family wants me to come home and try to rebuild my old life. But I don't think I can go back to being the person I was before this happened. What do you think you want to do? Dr. Morrison asked. I want to help people like me, David replied, his voice carrying a conviction that reminded both of them of the confidence that Marcus Whitfield had possessed. People who've suffered brain injuries, who've lost their memories, who are struggling with questions of identity and self. I understand what that feels like in ways that no textbook can teach. Dr. Morrison smiled, recognizing in David's decision the emergence of a new identity that was neither the timid accountant nor the arrogant royal guard, but something entirely different and potentially more powerful than either. That's an excellent goal, she said, and I think your unique experience could indeed help others who are facing similar challenges. As David left Dr. Morrison's office that afternoon, he walked with a posture that was neither the hunched shoulders of David, Chun the accountant, nor the rigid bearing of Marcus Whitfield, the royal guard. Instead, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had been broken down completely and rebuilt himself from the pieces that remained. His phone buzzed with a text message from his sister, asking if he wanted to join the family for dinner. For the first time since his real identity had been revealed, David found himself genuinely looking forward to spending time with these people who claimed to love him. Not because he remembered loving them, but because he was beginning to believe that love was something that could be built rather than just remembered. The universe had indeed delivered its promised lesson to the man who had awakened that morning believing himself to be Marcus Whitfield, Royal Guard. But the lesson hadn't been about humility or respect for authority, as it might have appeared to the crowd of spectators who had watched his arrest. Instead, it had been about the fundamental nature of identity itself, and the possibility that sometimes losing yourself completely is the only way to discover who you were meant to be. Marcus Whitfield had been destroyed, but David Chun had been reborn. And this new version of David carried within him the confidence of Marcus and the humility of his original self, creating someone who was more complete than either identity had been alone. 3 months later, David would begin working as a counselor specializing in brain injury recovery. 2 years after that, he would establish a foundation to help families dealing with memory loss and identity disorders. And 5 years down the road, he would write a book about his experience that would become required reading for psychology students around the world. The man who had once believed himself superior to everyone around him had indeed received the karma he deserved. But it hadn't come in the form of punishment or humiliation. Instead, it had come as an opportunity to become someone genuinely worthy of the respect he had always demanded but never earned. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor that was far more sophisticated than anyone could have imagined. And sometimes the best way to teach someone about real authority was to strip away all their false power and then give them the chance to build something genuine from the ground up. David Chun walked into his future with the steady gait of someone who finally understood the difference between commanding respect and earning it, and that understanding would serve him well in the remarkable life that lay ahead of him.